Kia ora everyone. No te aroa tainui me mā tātua waka tūpuna hau, ko Maia tōku ingoa. My name is Maia, and I herald from the mighty rohe circled up on this map, the te aroa tainui and mā tātua waka rohe. If you listen to my brother, who's over here, he's got us on about 7 of the waka tūpuna, but I'm not going to rattle off that my great-great-grandmother was a haimona, so i Ngāti Porou, or my great-uncle built Stan Walker's whare in Tūhoi, although he did, and that's really quite cool. I'm a pretty solid kind of Central North Island Māori, talk a lot. I can't sing, which is quite impressive to be from there and not be able to sing. But in case the complexion escaped you, I am also white. My mum's parents both immigrated over after World War II. My grandma from the dodgy side of Liverpool with Scottish, Irish and Welsh background, and my grandpa from Delden, a village no one has ever heard of, in Twente, a city no one has ever heard of, in Overijssel, a province no one has ever heard of, in the Netherlands, a country a lot of people think isn't real. Engari, we're not here to talk about me, although that is my personal favourite topic. We are here to talk about rangahau takatapui, rangahau irahuhua. So I'm a last year PhD candidate. I submit in like 2 weeks, and I rolled into my PhD from a Masters of Indigenous Studies focused on rangahau Māori research methods. Despite my background being in environmental politics and political journalism, I have shifted over into tattooing, tāmoko, and transness. Odds are, if you are in this Zoom, you're either gay, Māori, or a gay Māori. Odds are further then that you have at least one tattoo. There's a lot of literature out there about queer people and body modification, a lot of literature about Māori and tattooing, but very little, none, about the two being put together. This is what I'm looking at. So the thesis is super broad. It touches on how Māori conceptualize gender, responses from our complicated relationships with some more conservative Māori, the political and religious history of tāmoko, how it even covers the creation of a new form of tāmoko. That's not really doable in 20 minutes, so I thought this presentation could be good to just sort of outline some divergences and parallels between Māori tattooing and Western queer tattoo culture. Gell claims that it is impossible to make any clear distinction between Western ideas about tattooing that derive from educated perceptions of the practice as characteristic of the ethnic other, which is the tattooed native, versus perceptions of tattooing as a stigma of the class other, the tattooed sailor or the tattooed criminal, or in our case, the tattooed gay. So if the general normative eye can't really distinguish between native cultural and non-native cultural tattoos, where does that leave us? The idea of bodies is really important to this question. It's not just about the tattoo or the ink, it's about the canvas that it's on. The idea of bodies as an intersection between society and power isn't new and has been handled extensively through your classics, Foucault, Butler, Halberstam, and a load of other people. The idea of Indigenous bodies being particularly potent for this mind-body divide has also been addressed by a load of typically white people, normally in line with the argument that natives are grounded, embodied people and not very intelligent, while the civil European is a creature of the enlightened mind. Queer theory jumped in here to kind of say we reject that Cartesian mind-body split, and they flung the idea of body-self-society around, typically with the postmodern flair that the field is known for. So in this understanding, everyone has knowledge in the body and in the mind. They're kind of all this weird amalgamation that makes up one person. However, as with most work in the sector, the academic sector, there have been a series of kind of invisible rules put in place. So the first of these restrictions, the native shall never, ever have control. They cannot understand. Their massive heads are simply too big for their thoughts to meet, and they just cross like ships in the night. The idea of Indigenous people knowing about their own tattoos and meanings is just not. It's simply not. They just kind of do things for fun. The second is that the truth of a person can be known, and it's not like the entirety of existential philosophy and coming of age media is any indication that this might not be the case. Third, you get to have one marginalized identity. You're either gay or you're native. Anything else, get out of here. As any social scientist will tell you, these lines are complete nonsense and a product of their context. In reality, no one's brain is actually that remarkable, given we routinely derive entertainment from hee hee cat make funny, and the quest for self is an inevitably ongoing expedition. Everyone identifies and is identified as everything all the time. So queer Indigenous tattooing often straddles completely conflicting models of tattooing. They kind of have to jump between all three of these things. As an example, first tattoo I ever got was a ka moko, this traditional piece. I got it when I was 17 in an almost impressively racist high school. Those who are able to read moko will pull out some characteristics immediately from this. It's positioned on my left thigh. The leg is typically placement for grounding purposes. It centers on this manaya piece at the top. It's a guardian design that's used to protect the bearer, in my case, from the incredibly racist high school. It features potama within koru, an indicator of growth through achievement. And finally, it's red, which means I love the colour red. And also, tino rangatiratanga and all that. But when I'm asked about my first tattoo, I don't say it was my moko. Though there are overlaps which could make the distinction seemingly unimportant, this I count as my first tattoo. My first moko was for my family, and my first tattoo was for my family. But I say they're different things because moko and tattoos are not the same. Those outside of Indigenous tattooing would likely see tattoos and moko or pea or tunit as tattoos with a brown flair. But those within Indigenous tattooing typically categorize them as two different things. It's well recorded on literature and tattooing that it serves opposite functions. It indicates group identity as well as individualizes. This is the kind of first tension between queer and Indigenous embodiment. My queer tattoos, including a gender deviant king and queen, a bisexual Sappho quote, I wish I was joking, and a soft lesbian mermaid, are not the same as my moko. My Indigenous tattoo can't be described necessarily, and the exact design wasn't my choice. It doesn't represent an idea of the self as is, like those other ones do. It represents the idea of the self as it always has been. The second tension is demonstrated through these two absolute gems that are regrettably permanently attached to me. Though they look solid enough, this one was done on a horse cart on a random Saturday by a guy who took vape breaks and gave me aftercare in a ketchup container, and this one has too many legs. They, in looking in tattoos as art, are kind of complete and utter failures. I wheel these out at parties as crowd pleasers, starting with, how many legs does a spider have? You'd think it's 8. Or, turns out fitting 2 6-foot-tall, broad-shouldered people into a horse cart and expecting precision isn't incredibly realistic. I cried when I got the spider. Genuinely, I left the studio and I had like a rom-com run through the wind to my mate's house where I sobbed on their doorstep before drinking some juice to calm down kind of moment. It's the only tattoo I actually do regret. Doesn't mean a lot, it's kind of just ugly. The horse cart, though it's messy and not that meaningful, and technically probably worse, it's already bleeding all over the place, is a tattoo I would never take back though. I got it exclusively to make a friend happy, to provide something so ridiculous she would have no choice but to laugh at it. From the reasoning I gave, which was we were there for the magic show and it had a 30-minute delay, to the tattoo itself, the aftercare in a sauce container, and the fact that my legs went dead, so I literally just fell out of the cart and onto the ground. There's absolutely no dignity in this tattoo. But she laughed and we still reference it, and that made it worth it. For Indigenous tattooing, it is this process which matters just as much, if not more, than the design itself. So if we go back here, I didn't really know what I was getting. I just sort of showed up, said, I want to represent this. He went, cool, let's go. This one, I knew a lot more. For these, I knew I wanted a spider. I was very specific about it. Didn't think I needed to say the number of legs. Here we are. Whereas the other one, I just kind of pulled up. I don't know if that would count as Indigenous tattooing, but it certainly was more process driven. But yeah, for Indigenous tattooing, typically it's the process that matters. Turu Mākina Daily defines the definition as moko is 90% process and 1% tattoo. Kirituhi, tribal pieces, is all tattoo. For queer and white tattooing, typically it's the design that matters. That's the thing you agonize over. That's the thing you want to represent. Artists are found based on their ability to tattoo the specific design or their ability to be as outwardly gay as you, not necessarily because of how you two connect. My tāmoko artist was chosen based on whakapapa. Literally never met him before. He jammed this thing into my body. Modern tattoos exert a representation of self that exists within the mind. It has no set or tied state of its own. You sort of say, this is who I think I am. They are individualistic in nature, according to Rohith et al., and are often used to reiterate the idea that we are the sovereign ground of our own action, as said by old mate Judy Butler. The third tension comes from this piece. The shark had meaning as it's the name of my tribe, Te Arawa, and the hammerhead's role in saving us from Te Koroko or Te Parata, a whirlpool in Te Moana Nui Akua. This tattoo is coupled with an octopus on the opposing arm, a nod to the octopus navigation of the Pacific Islands, and the whakatauki kawe ma te wheke e ma te ururoa. But these meanings have kind of since faded into the background. A new meaning rose, which started on December 25th, 2021. I was walking on the beach with my brother, having the dreaded experience of an insecure fat kid walking back from swimming. My shorts were clinging to me, my hair was salt water, and my face was bright red. I then encountered the greatest enemy anyone can ever know, male youths. Immediately I jumped to the worst. It was a little too easy for them to make a beached whale joke. Without thinking, I kind of spun around to walk backwards, bearing my shark tattoo to the youths. I walked straighter, confident that they would not see the squish of my arms, but instead be drawn to the massive shark on them. I came back to Wellington with a new mission. Tattoos were no longer fun little things I wanted to remember. I needed to be covered. And this was such a weird experience that I'd never seen anyone talk about before. Now, before the keyboard warriors come out, I'm not saying that all people don't experience isolation from their bodies. It's a uniquely me experience. Certainly restrictions from gender-affirming care and reproductive agency would show that they do. But tattoos for these groups who experience that kind of structural isolation are almost framed as self-empowering, asserting a true self which is at odds with what is expected of them. It's this idea of reclaiming the body. I've given a talk about a similar observation before, and it was so interesting because I was right after a Pākehā trans guy who said that he got tattooed so he could feel like he was marking his skin, which he saw as, in his words, a blank canvas. But my father, before getting his tāmoko, was already marked. He was brown. Before I had tattoos, I was marked. I'm fat and vaguely ethnic, though my pale skin does let me get away with a lot more than my darker family. As much as you shouldn't need to, and there's a whole thing about validating feelings, there is an ability to hide queerness or femininity behind socially accepted ways of being. Indeed, a lot of queer people and women are drawn to tattooing explicitly because it marks and stigmatizes them. It makes a normative body queer and a feminine body dangerous. Tattooing is an easy way for visibly privileged people to bridge the gap between their non-normative self and normative body by tapping into a cultural property associated with marginalization. It's why tattoos have always come from the marginalized. You're already told you're on the fringes of society, so you may as well make it permanent. Indigenous and policed bodies don't need this. We have it already. Indeed, every time someone gets a tattoo in a visible place to signal they're an outsider or cool, it means that the communities the stigma derives from Indigenous, and often incarcerated communities have that stigma reinforced, and they can't escape the negative implications of being stigmatized. I'm thinking here about Ariana Grande's Dangerous Woman era, where her shorthand was a load of fake tan and hand tattoos, or Dove Cameron's current edgy era with sharp eyeliner and also hand tattoos, both of them using it to break away from their innocent branding. Very rarely do people talk about what it's like to just want to do a cultural practice, take on tāmoho, but you wind up being seen as a gang member. And these people who take on tattoos to tap into the stigma continue to keep that alive. So we have three tensions between queer and Māori tattooing, which for queer Māori can be kind of a mission. The tattoos for the self versus other, I went a slide ahead. Tattoos as a process for body modification, or tattoos as the first and final mark on the skin canvas. This is not to say that all non-Indigenous tattoos are selfish and all Indigenous ones are selfless, but that these are trends which the designs tend to follow. Where tattoos have tried to bridge the gap, it's been a problematic train wreck that you can kind of have to admire. Brutal Black, a project by two white artists, specifically emphasizes the process and obligation of tattoos. And you go, cool, that sounds like an Indigenous thing. They had one of their artists brag about how their style was ignorant, violent, and primitive, while the other said their goal was to make people look like savages, primitive and tribal. When Western tattoos try to challenge this individual design ethos, they tend to just rip off the Indigenous mode. This is classic modern primitivism, a direct rejection of the hyper-technological, neoliberal, capitalist climate of the late 20th century. The modern primitive is typically characterized as a white urban dweller who relies on reiterations of Indigenous cultures rather than the creations of new ones to give themselves spiritual and visual fulfillment. Another classic example was that trend a couple years back of everyone saging their apartments to get rid of the vibes. This primitivism is connected to the notion of the noble savage, where Europeans and white Americans romanticized Indigenous peoples as closer to nature, more communal, and more sexually open, notions of the primitive that continue to exist in the Western imagination. But this is not just dog on Western society's hour. When Indigenous tattooers cater to individual sensibilities, it's hardly any more successful. A few years back, a woman went under fire for receiving her moko kauai, the chin tattoo, in white ink. Her reasoning was to be different, not harsh and more elegant than darker tattoos. When Māori then challenged her on it, she switched to say she got white explicitly because it would be a bold statement. Trying to make moko kauai unique to the bearer in a modern Māori context can often backfire because we say it isn't tika or right for an individual to make those decisions. But as Mikaere says, by mindlessly adhering to what one or two experts lay down as tikanga, we're exhibiting an intellectual laziness that does not bode well for the future. We run the risk of perpetuating colonized tikanga, the practice of which is doing extraordinary damage to our whānau and hapu. We encourage the nonsensical characterization of tikanga as rigid and incapable of change. So, how do we resolve this? Tattoos, misogyny, racism, modern primitive, everyone's appropriating everyone. How do we get around it? I'd say we do the anthropology thing and we look at people. My tattoos are Māori and queer because I am Māori and queer. I chose the placement of my moko because I knew that moko kauai now means woman and puhoro now means man. I chose the graphic, illustrative style and red accents of all of the rest of my tattoos because it would blend with my moko, a kind of constant signaling to Māori identity without ever saying it. To break down that final line, people are not just gender or native, and as such, tattoos are not just social or personal. How the self is perceived as a relational identity kind of seems antithetical to the purposes of tattoos, which, by practicality, can't be shared unless you peel off your skin, which is the worst secret Santa in the world. Yet despite the fact that overwhelming consensus characterizes tattoos as the exteriorization of the interior, which is simultaneously the interiorization of the exterior, Indigenous peoples have seen them as signs that the interior and exterior, self and social, are one and the same. Queerness, slowly moving away from prioritizing this perfect representation of an individual with all of its labels and all of its specifics of identity, is making moves to position gender as something both held and placed onto a person. Within this really, really messy social dialogue, tattoos can provide a startling permanence. Their existence can't be denied or rewritten. Even if you laser them out, there's typically still markings. Similarly, the individual and relational nature of people can't be denied. No one is entirely social, but no one is exempt from others. I have 2 tattoos of chairs on my arms. They mean literally nothing. Haven't even retrospectively put meaning onto them. I needed gaps filled. She wanted to do chairs. They're mine, on my body, of my choice, but they are also others. They impact how people see me, what they make of me, and what they think a tattoo should be for. They're on my Maia as an individual's body, but they're also on my Maia as a fat, queer, half native person's body. And what they impact how people see me, what they make of me, and what they think a tattoo should be for. We're back to taste classifies, and it also classifies the classifier. Because what is the social scientist if not the shadow of Bordeaux? Thank you for listening.
I'm curious about Mana Tipua methodologies and how that kind of, was woven into your research in this project.
Yeah. So it kind of started, Mana Tipua is has a really interesting whakapapa because it's like a spin-off of a spin-off of a spin-off. So kaupapa Māori theory comes from mātauranga Māori in general. So it's been around for thousands of years, but as a theory, it popped up in the 80s, directly correlated to kura kaupapa Māori. Then in the 80s and 90s, wahine Māori kind of started to notice they were being left out of those conversations because Māori love a patriarchy. So they started to shift to mana wahine theory. Mana wahine theory then kind of did what a lot of feminism can do. Oh, someone's going. Started to shift to what a lot of feminism can do, where it's getting a little bit like women derive power from their wombs and the divine feminine, and that everyone's one of two, and it all got a bit weird. So Elizabeth Kerekere and that kind of landmark 2017 thesis we all would know about introduced this kind of term mana tipua to sort of still have the mana wahine focus, but it's specifically queer. And then literally no one ever talked about it again because she went into politics. So I kind of, for this thesis, was like, I'm going to develop this methodology. So it draws from kaupapa Māori, mana wahine, feminist theory, and queer theory, and it all comes together. And it's like pretty basic research principles. So it's things like a lot of these ideas, participants in my research spoke about the same thing, but you can't kind of divide the researcher away from the research. So I was like, cool, I'll use my tattoos to talk about your ideas as opposed to just entirely taking someone else's whakaaro. It's also things around like there needs to be a degree of giving back and a degree of support for the research process. So like every one I did, I used that Victoria University budget. I bought a lot of things that I just gave to participants. Part of the process and kind of where this original thing of like queer versus Māori tattooing came from, I paid for participants to be tattooed by a takatapui queer Māori artist. And she was like kind of buzzing over that because she went, I normally have to tattoo either gay tattoos or Māori ones. She hadn't really had the chance to do both. And then that sort of design process, she was like, oh, how would you represent? Because there is a Māori design language that is deeply social, but queer tattoos are often quite personal. What do you do with that? So that's kind of, yeah, Mana Tipua is that researching within two different spaces. That's that.
It's a very fuzzy question about future directions for looking at how individual almost ownership of the intellectual property conveyed on the canvas that is the body and the greater collective ownership with whakapapa as for tā moko, but also where, and coming into biometrics and data sovereignty, where DNA is actually linking to the group. So there's a whole thing at the moment where New Zealand government is saying to the US government, hey, would you like the biometric data of all New Zealanders that we've got information for? And so this whole thing of like ownership and who has got the rights to speak to things. So tattoos as parts of our embodiment and how we are identified by others could be seen as part of biometrics by some surveillance state. And so I'm sort of, like, as I say, it's a very fuzzy question, but I'm interested in ideas on who should be speaking for the protection and representations of what is conveyed on the ink on people's bodies. And it's both collective and individual. So I'll let you sit with that, and it may take a bit of unpicking.
No, I talked about it in my thesis. I talk about Y262, which is the tribunal claim on intellectual property, but also flora, fauna. Tā moko comes up in that as well. I think there's kind of two things. So firstly, with biometric, it's really interesting because quite common practice for tā moko is, I don't know if anyone, like, you get tattooed, you bleed a lot, and like needles and stuff go into your skin. And I've had 3 like moko or moko adjacent things. Every time they've given me a bag with my like blood and stuff in it, because they're like, this is your biometric, this is your body, you need to dispose of this in the way that you want. And like a lot of Māori, if they go to a hairdresser, they'll ask to take their hair away with them. Whereas in non-Māori spaces, it's like, no, that's unhygienic. I need to dispose of what you're doing. So yeah, there's really interesting stuff in tattooing of that sort of, it is a body part, it is blood, what are you doing with that? In terms of the sort of surveillance, it's really interesting. The government did identity check the facial recognition stuff, just didn't test it on anyone with moko kanohi, with face tattoos, so it doesn't work on them. And there's been some stuff on facial recognition and tattooing where, particularly pōngiangia, which is on the nose, if you have that, facial recognition picks that up as being your eyes, not your eyes, because the features of a tā moko, the lines are a lot more sharp than they are just your normal facial features. So weirdly, moko kanohi can be quite good for counter surveillance because it literally just doesn't know what it's picking up. But then also you have the opposite where they just go, oh, it was one of those Māori with a face tattoo who stole this thing, and they just pick up the first one they see. So yeah, there's really not a lot being done in terms of facial recognition and in terms of intellectual property. It's such a grey area because intellectual property, you kind of need ownership. So it's like, who owns the design? Is it the bearer? Is it the artist? For tā moko, a lot of the time they're working with design elements and principles that were made hundreds, thousands of years ago. They didn't invent it. Who has the ownership? So it's that question of, again, we have a legal system which is like, for a queer tattoo, like I've got a mermaid tattooed on me, she was quite clear where she was like, this is like my tattoo, I'm going to offer it on more flash sheets or whatever, is that fine? And I was like, yeah, sick. Whereas the tā moko, they just kind of wouldn't be like, I'm just going to whack yours onto somebody else. So yeah, interesting questions, and just no one's really talking about it that much.
This webinar was brought to you by Community Research. Community Research is an open access archive where you can find research and resources by and for the communities of Aotearoa. Find out more at communityresearch.org.nz.